What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the first edition of the Ship My Money Show Tournament Edition. It is Monday, July 8th. This is going to be a new show that I'm trying out closer to lock around that 5 p.m. time. Giving us time after this show to still build lineups, but a little bit later on in the day where we do have some lineups out. And I just want to use it as a show to talk tournament strategy specifically. The show in the morning obviously can be useful because you're just getting an overview of the slate. But I also know that it's a lot of like, well, you could play this guy, you could not play that guy. There's a lot of different ways to attack the slate. So I thought it would be interesting to do a show looking at what I would be playing if the slate were starting right now. I went through my lineup building process before the show, got a set of lineups, prepared all of that just in time for the Braves to push Chris Sale to tomorrow. So this show is essentially useless from what I'm doing on tonight's slate standpoint. I don't have time to go back and redo everything and then start over. I will still walk through everything and show what I would have been doing if Chris Sale was pitching and the slate started at 5. But pretty funny timing on that one. Literally as the show is about to go live, the pitcher that I had 74% of gets pushed to tomorrow. But encouraging questions in chat also as I go through. One thing that I think gets messed up in a lot of DFS content is there's like such an emphasis on ownership that people will be like, oh, you can't play that guy at high ownership, or that guy is way too low owned, or whatever it may be. If you are familiar with using sim tools, if you've used them a lot, one thing that you've probably noticed is that you can create lineups that are expected to be good with most individual players, or even team stacks in them. You just have to create the rest of the lineup in specific ways that make them useful. So I think that's a spot too where, going through this, you'll be able to see like, maybe I don't have as much Ellie De La Cruz, even though I obviously do, but he was an example from this morning that I thought maybe I wouldn't have as much as the field. But you could still then look at the individual lineups and be like, okay, well, if you do want to play Ellie De La Cruz, like if you're watching this show and you are dead set on playing somebody like that, you can look at how individual lineups look that have that player in them as well. So I do think that there are different takeaways we should be able to get from this show. I'm looking forward to it also because hopefully I'll be able to catch mistakes that I'd be making before I make them. I think anybody that's followed me for a while is aware that I have a tendency to screw things up around lock. So I'm looking forward to it from that angle as well. I'm not going to get bogged down in my actual process for creating the lineups. If that's something you're interested in, the link for Endgame Syndicate is in the description below. I have several videos out detailing exactly how I build my lineups and choose my lineups. Utica has gone through his process. Brick has gone through his. So if you're looking for that kind of stuff, kind of what happens before we get to this point, check out the link in the description below. But I think we can use this to just kind of go through talking tournament strategy in general. And everybody in chat now pointing out that Chris Sale isn't pitching. So not exactly how I wanted this show to go for the first time. As you can see, I would have been playing a ton of him, but for the sake of just still talking tournament strategy, you can see that Sale, was projected for like 55% ownership. I'd said it on my show this morning, but I fully expected to be getting to a lot of him, and I would have been, just because pitcher is generally a spot where I don't differentiate as much. It's only getting you different in one spot in your lineup. And on a slate like tonight, Sale was just so much better in terms of projection than every other pitcher that it didn't make sense to me as a spot where I really wanted to be getting away from him just because he was popular. I thought, for lack of a better phrase, that he was good chalk. Now, with him being gone, obviously, it's going to impact everything else. Bryce Elder is replacing him. Bryce Elder is not a particularly good strikeout pitcher. He is decent at limiting production, if I remember correctly, at least off the top of my head. I obviously haven't looked into him today because he wasn't pitching until 3 minutes ago. But he generally, so he hasn't pitched much this year. If you go back to last year, 13.8% K percentage against lefties, 21.4% against righties, 168 expected ISO to lefties, 137 to righties. It is a tough matchup for him. The Diamondbacks don't strike out a lot. They do have quality hitters in their lineup. So I don't anticipate him being a huge part of what I'm doing tonight or what the field is doing. So I think what's going to end up happening now with Chris Sale, it's going to have a really, really big impact on this slate in a variety of ways, because now you really do just have a ton of pitchers that look very, very similar. If you look at the projection that excuse me, that I have for these guys, every pitcher except for Abbott projects for between 10 and 15 DraftKings points. Obviously 15 is 1.5 times as many as 10, but realistically, when you factor in how much volatility there is in baseball, these guys all look very, very similar. Um, for the most part, they are similarly priced. Like Gavin Williams at 8,500, um, basically the most expensive guy on the slate now. So I think you're going to get ownership basically just increasing on like everybody, but um mostly on Andrew Abbott. He was already projected for like 40%. I think you're going to see that go up. And then you're going to see Gray, Diaz, Williams all see a nice bump. Feltner probably a little bit. And then instead of like 5% ownership on Montero, Daniel, and Flexen, you'll probably on those guys see that come up closer to like 10, maybe 12%. So I don't really think there's likely to be like a super low owned pitcher. Bryce Elder will still get some ownership, I assume, as well, assuming that he's not very limited here. I don't think you're going to get like sub 5% owned pitchers. I do expect Abbott to far and away be the most popular. But the other impact that Sale being out is going to have on the slate is with it being a 5-game slate, it was already a slate where negatively correlating with popular pitching was going to be a pretty interesting strategy. Now, even more so, because you're just getting the ownership inflated on a bunch of not very good pitchers because there is nowhere else to go. At least when Chris Sale was pitching, that was taking up one of those roster spots. And like on FanDuel, for example, you only have to roster the one pitcher. So you were just going to get a ton of Chris Sale and not a lot of ownership to any one other guy. Now without Sale, whatever pitcher you're playing, they have legitimate question marks. Like even Andrew Abbott, he's probably going to be the highest owned pitcher on this slate. He has an 18.5% strikeout percentage this year, 4.94 xFIP, and he's pitching in the most favorable hitter park on the slate. Yeah, the matchup with the Rockies is good. Abbott does project to have a higher strikeout percentage going forward, but it's not like he's an ace or anything close to it. So now essentially you just have a slate where you're going to be getting a bunch of ownership to pitchers that aren't very good, and that's going to drive up, or it should drive up at least, your willingness to play offenses against popular pitchers, because none of these guys are getting ownership as a function of how good they are. They're getting ownership as a function of what does not exist on this slate, basically. So Sale being out has just a massive impact on everything. It changes the offenses that you're going to play. It obviously makes Arizona look like a better offense also, because now they are facing Bryce Elder and not Chris Sale. It's pretty difficult to get. You can't really get a bigger bump than that. So they're going to look better. That's going to pull down ownership on teams like Texas, Minnesota, Cincinnati. Those teams are still going to look good, but Arizona will look better and probably cut into their ownership a bit. So it's really a wide open slate now. Stephen Leibowitz said Rockies have a 25% K percentage against lefties. Yeah, it's a very good matchup for Abbott, but it's not like he's a really good pitcher in a good matchup. It shouldn't surprise anybody if Andrew Abbott has a bad game against any team, regardless of who they are. Obviously, the matchup with Colorado is about as good as it can get, though. Still like a 4 to 4.5 implied run total there for the Rockies. So if we look at what I was getting to pitcher wise before that news, I was pretty much on Sale and Abbott, which again, they just project so much better than most of the other pitchers that doesn't really surprise me. I wouldn't be surprised now, depending on what happens with Abbott's ownership, if I actually don't end up getting a lot more than I already was. Like you can see here that I was getting to 56% before the show. Let's say his ownership comes up to like 60%. He is a relatively better pitcher now that Sale isn't pitching. But if his ownership gets up to like 60, 65%, that's probably a pretty efficient ownership mark. And I wouldn't be surprised if I still could just kind of end up in that range on Abbott and then end up getting to more of these other guys. John Gray's ownership probably comes up. I was right around the field on him. I would think that I probably still end up around the field on Gray. He's in a good matchup against the Angels. Not a good park to pitch in, but it is a weak offense, particularly against right-handed pitching. There are strikeouts in that lineup. John Gray himself is one of the more talented pitchers on this slate. So I would expect that I'm still getting there. And then what actually happens with the ownership on these other guys is going to be really interesting. I had a really, really big fade on Gavin Williams here, which I don't really know the reason. I think he's a pretty good pitcher, but he was projected for like 31% ownership and only showed up in 1 out of the 50 lineups that I built. So this is like a perfect example, I think, of you can definitely make lineups that are good with Gavin Williams. It's not that Gavin Williams is a bad play. He has a good matchup. He's in a good park. He is only making his second start of the season after coming back from injury. He did get lit up by the White Sox in his first start. So there certainly is volatility there, but you can definitely make good Gavin Williams lineups. For whatever reason, I just wasn't getting there. I was pretty heavily prioritizing Sale and Abbott. I would assume that I'm getting to more Williams now that I need to reallocate 75% of my lineups to a different pitcher. But his ownership probably also comes up. So decent chance that I'm still just not getting to as much Gavin Williams. It does make me interested to see if maybe I was getting to the Tigers as a contrarian stack against him. That would just kind of make sense from a portfolio standpoint. But pitching wise, I think overall, if any pitcher, basically outside of Abbott, because he does project better, is getting a massive amount of ownership, I'm not saying you have to get away from them because, again, you can make good lineups that have them. It is only one spot in your lineup. But given the amount of volatility there's going to be in pitching on this slate, I wouldn't have an issue saying, if the field is just going to pick one of these guys and play them 50%, that's just going to be the guy that I don't play much of and I play other guys. That is a perfectly reasonable approach. That is basically what it looks like I was doing with Gavin Williams previously. So I will be interested to see sort of how I reallocate my pitcher exposures. Looking at the stacks I was getting to, I wasn't really getting to Detroit. That surprises me. And I honestly don't really like it. Like if I were going into this slate just not playing Gavin Williams, which I was, I think I would like to be getting my money on the Tigers just because it's a small enough slate and pitching is so weak on this slate that if Gavin Williams doesn't have a good game and has a performance where like I just don't have the type of performance that I want if I don't have Gavin Williams, I should be probably getting some of my money on the Tigers just because there's not that many other offenses to go to. So that is something where, for example, after this show, I'd probably be going back and making sure that I don't have some sort of issue with my Gavin Williams projection or something like that. Because ideally, I think if I am taking a huge fade like that, I would probably want to be getting more of the Tigers. You don't have to. It just, in my mind, makes sense where instead of playing for that middle, which is reasonable because Williams is 8,500. It's not like he's cheap. So there are ways the Tigers score 4 or 5 runs. Williams isn't very good, and I also don't want the Tigers. But usually, if I'm not getting to a popular pitcher like that, I'm going to actually be getting to the opposing offense. I wasn't today, and in that park, I guess it also isn't the end of the world. Like the Tigers can score 4, 5, 6 runs, and basically none of them be home runs because it's so difficult to hit home runs in Comerica. So I guess that's another reason why it would make some sense to just not have either side there. But usually if I'm not getting to a popular pitcher, I do get to the opposing offense a little bit more. I was getting to a lot of Cincinnati as far as all stacks, not as much in 5-mans. So that was something I am getting to them a lot in 4-mans and 3-mans. That was something I did mention this morning that I thought might be the case. If we look at Cincinnati hitters and look at their ownership, they're pretty popular throughout the lineup. 20% projected ownership coming into De La Cruz, 19% to India, 10 plus to basically the entire lineup. I think we might have gotten this lineup also after I built lineups, but either way, you were getting ownership to pretty much the whole team. And so if you're 5-man stacking them, it can make it tough to be different elsewhere. Obviously you're taking up 5 out of your 10 lineup spots. They're all relatively popular. So I think and that is one of the reasons why I'm generally more willing to play popular pitching is it's just one spot as opposed to the 5. But Cincinnati's still clearly in a good spot. They're hitting in Great American. It's a great park to hit in. Ryan Feltner's not bad, but he's not a lights out pitcher or anything like that. So I do still want to be getting to the Reds. And if you look at my exposures versus the field, I was getting over the field. It just wasn't in a ton of 5-mans, but it was just mixing them into a lot of different lineups. I was getting the 40% Candelario, 30% De La Cruz, 26% on Benson and India, 22% on Stevenson, 20 on Marte. So I am getting to this team a lot. I'm curious to see what my 5-mans actually look like as far as like the total ownership there. And was I able to get away from some other spots? Looks like Brendan Rodgers' ownership came down a lot since this morning. So with a low ownership projection on him, that was making some sense. Like I'm using him to differentiate, and then Tommy Pham and Adam Duvall. So a few low projected, low owned guys there. This one you have Montero, who was projected to be a low owned pitcher. Brenton Doyle going against a popular Abbott at 5%. So you can see that I'm mixing in, low owned pieces, also some negatively correlated pieces against Abbott, for example, in those 5-man stacks. And then in mini stacks, I can use more popular hitters, more popular pitchers, and mix in the reds, because the thinking there is if I'm playing a lower owned stack and they're doing well, I have less competition at the top of the tournament. And at that point, I pretty much just want the best plays around that low owned stack. So that's where mixing in like De La Cruz plus Candelario or whatever works out. So that's, just a roster construction thing. And it goes back to my point at the beginning of the show of, just simply looking at a hitter and saying, oh, they're popular, you shouldn't play them in a vacuum isn't really the way to go about it. If you have a low owned team, you can pretty much play whoever you want around that stack. And if you're stacking a popular team, that's fine. You just need to be finding low owned pieces that make sense. And usually there's not going to be that many of those, which is why you'll see good players end up not getting to the most popular stacks, the most likely, stacks that are most likely to succeed as often as maybe the general public. Stephen Leibowitz said, do you think the casuals are going to just go to Williams as the next highest priced guy? Yeah, I think Williams and Abbott are both going to see their ownership go up a lot. I think John Gray's will go up a lot as well. I think I kind of missed Williams when I was looking through it because I didn't have him, but I would think those are the three that soak up the bulk of Chris Sale's ownership. You had them projected in basically their own ownership tier already with Abbott, Gray, and Williams. So I think, those are the three that I think you'll see go up quite a bit. And then everybody else probably just like trickles in behind them. They are also just like the best pitchers on the slate. They're in the best matchups. So except for, they're in the best matchups. So I think you'll see a lot of ownership coming into those guys. I still think Abbott will end up being number one. So then Minnesota, another team where they're not getting any negative correlation. That's something that I don't really like on a 5-game slate, but they do look good. They're pretty cheap. They're in a pretty good park. They have the best matchup on the slate, I think, against Flexen. So I'm still getting to them. As far as 5-mans go, them and Atlanta were the teams that I'm getting to the second most behind Colorado. I'm getting to them second most as far as all stack types. So I think that they still look good. Like they're good values. They're in a good spot. They have the highest implied run total on the board. They are projected to be popular. I'm getting to them pretty close to the field in most cases. I'm getting to a lot of Buxton individually. But other than that, I'm pretty much around the field. I don't mind any of that. Again, Flexen gives up power to both sides of the plate. He has been better so far this season at limiting power to righties than he was going back to last year. But overall, just not a very good pitcher. Happy to get to Minnesota. You do want to be careful what the rest of those teams look like. So looking at like some of these 5-man Minnesota stacks and the ownership projections. So you can see here, this 5-man Minnesota stack, 2-man Detroit makes a ton of sense there. You have these 5 popular Twins bats, but here going to Kana and Colt Keith, they're both projected for less than 10% ownership. So you have 2 sub 10% guys mixed in with this popular Minnesota stack. But then they're also going up against Gavin Williams, who's projected at the time to be around 20% owned. Now, obviously, it'll be even higher. So not only do you have 2 just pretty low-owned guys with your Minnesota stack, thinking, okay, if Minnesota goes off and I get a good performance from Kana and Keith, that differentiates me. But also, if Minnesota goes off and I get a good game from Kana and Keith, the 20% of the field that played Gavin Williams is losing out. The people that don't have Minnesota are losing out, and the people that don't have those 2 Tigers are losing out. So that extra piece against Williams makes it a little bit more powerful as well. And then you had the Ozuna one-off against a relatively popular value pitcher as well. Pretty low owned, about 10%. So you can see those guys mixed in that stack. I think that looks like a really well-constructed lineup. Also, Ryan Feltner, one of the lower-owned pitchers. I think that he's a perfectly fine play. Cincinnati strikes out a lot. He's not a bad pitcher. The park does suck. So you can see that as well. You're going to have, obviously, this lineup had Sale, but you're going to have a lot of people going to Gavin Williams and John Gray and Andrew Abbott. Going to Ryan Feltner makes the lineup contrarian as well. If we look at this one up here at the top, John Gray was the SP2, so a little bit more popular. This lineup as a whole, a little bit more popular. But you are getting to Diaz against Andrew Abbott. So there, even though it's only one hitter in your lineup at sub 10%, you are still getting him against what was a 40% owned pitcher. So you're negatively correlating there, which is really strong. And that kind of just adds a little bit more contrarian weight to your lineup. So I do like the way that those lineups are constructed. I think that's how you should be going about constructing lineups that are popular in general. The Demonat said, what happens with Montero? And Sean Jeezy said, what are your thoughts on Montero? Montero, I think, becomes a bigger part of the slate now for sure. He was somebody that previously you didn't really need. It's not a good strikeout matchup for him, but he is just underpriced at $4,000. So I think he probably becomes a little bit more useful now just because you don't have Sale. The counterpoint is now without Sale, there's nothing that you need to pay for. One thing I would say is if you generally set a minimum salary, lower it probably more than you normally do. I don't think that there's any real reason to be not even allowing yourself to consider a lineup that, for example, plays Montero instead of Diaz. There's no real difference between Montero and Diaz. But if you're using your typical minimum salary floor, let's say like 48,000, you could very easily just have a lineup that, or a build rather, that will only give you Diaz because you just have that arbitrary floor. So this is a weird slate where salary still matters. Like I wouldn't want to just be playing a bunch of like 41K lineups or anything. Obviously in a lot of builds, where you're leaving money on the table, you can upgrade something, you can get better hitters, whatever it may be. But Montero really isn't functionally different than Diaz. He's not that different than Daniel, who's $4,000 more expensive. So if you look over here at projection, Daniel projected for like less than 1 full point better than Montero. Diaz is like 3 points better. Feltner's 2 points better. So that is one thing. Maybe you actually see still relatively low ownership on Montero for that reason, that people just aren't willing to leave money on the table. If you had a lineup where like you're just playing good hitters throughout the lineup, you don't have anything you really want to improve there. You have, I don't know, Andrew Abbott, and then your options are just basically like anybody below John Gray. There's no reason that you like wouldn't consider Montero there. So that is something to keep an eye on Montero. Wes Anderson said, what type of post-processing do you do on the SaberSim lineups? I have videos on my entire process, start to finish, on Endgame, exactly what I do, how I end up where I end up. So check that out if you're interested. So yeah, that's Montero. I think is fine. It's still a bad strikeout matchup, bad matchup in general. It is a good park, but yeah, he's not really worse than most of these other guys. Like a 20% strikeout guy, he is stretched out enough. So I'm not going out of my way to get to him. I don't think you need the value, but the thing that, it just goes back to baseball being such a weird and volatile sport. If this were NBA, you probably just still would like ignore him because you don't have any superstars to pay for. You don't need that value play. In baseball, he's still relatively likely to just outscore like any of these other pitchers, basically. So I do think it'll be interesting to see where his ownership ends up being projected. And I would make sure that you're not just like accidentally excluding him from every lineup that you build or anything like that. So after those first two stacks, Cincinnati and Minnesota, those are both stacks that everybody's getting to. They're very obvious. But then you had Colorado showing up. And that's the kind of thing that I think I will be able to show on this show compared to like this morning or the morning show. Like in the morning, all that I can really say is getting to Colorado makes some sense because Abbott's popular. Here I can say that, if the slate had started at 5 with Chris Sale pitching, they would have been my highest owned 5-man stack. I'd have been getting to them a bit in 4-mans as well. They'd have been my third highest overall stack. And the big reason for that is just the ownership coming into Andrew Abbott. Andrew Abbott, when I ran all this stuff, was projected to be the second highest owned pitcher, around 40%. And as I was talking about before, he is in a really good spot. He is one of the best pitchers on the slate from a talent standpoint, but he's still not that good, and he's not having a very good season so far. So, and he's in a very tough pitcher's park. So when you're getting all of that ownership to Abbott, the first thing is just obviously if Colorado has a good game, 40% of the field is dead right there. But then on top of that, generally the ownership on a team like Colorado is just going to be pretty low because Abbott projects well, so Colorado doesn't project as well. People are playing Abbott, so then they're not playing Colorado. Now, one thing I do think you see happen a little bit more now that such a large percentage of the field are using Sims tools, and it's really difficult to account for, is you will see the teams like Colorado kind of get pushed up a little bit higher than their ownership projection, because when people use sims, as long as the sims are factoring in correlation in a way that makes sense, they will get bumped up just because of Abbott's ownership. So that is one thing to keep in mind, and it's tough to account for. And it does kind of suck when you think, for example, Colorado is just going to be 4%, 4 to like 7% owned, and then they're actually 10. Obviously, that changes the math. You wouldn't play them as much if you knew they were 10. But either way, they are going to be a low owned team, basically just as a function of Abbott being popular. But they're in a good park. They're not good at hitting. But Diaz, Tovar, Rogers, Doyle, those guys are all fine. Tolia's got some power. McMahon, lefty, but he can hit. Blackman's okay. Goodman's got some power. So it's not like this is a completely horrible offense, especially when you factor in Cincinnati and how relatively easy it is to hit home runs there. So I do like getting to Colorado. And you can see here that it's not, my entire night isn't dependent on Colorado, but I am quite a bit higher than the projected field. 7% ownership to Diaz and Tovar was projected when I ran this. I got to 20 to 22%. So I'm not putting myself in a situation where I am screwed if the Rockies don't have a good game. But I am putting myself in a situation where if the Rockies do have a good game, I have a lot of shots at winning because I am quite a bit over the field with these guys. TDID Forever said, is Bryce Elder going on their own? I have no idea. That news broke when I was starting the show, so I haven't looked at any updated ownership. I haven't run anything. I couldn't answer that. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what his ownership's projected for. I don't know how much of him I would play. I assume, will be low owned in general, but it is a tough matchup. He's not a very good strikeout pitcher. Off the top of my head, I think somebody said he was priced at 8K. Off the top of my head, I would say he should probably be like 10 to 15% owned, just because of this particular slate where every pitcher has question marks. The question marks on Elder are his matchup and his talent level, but most of these pitchers have those same two question marks. I would say like 10%, probably 10-ish percent, probably is like efficient ownership for him. So I don't know. I haven't looked at anything. That is basically a complete guess, but somewhat educated just based on having played a lot of DFS and knowing who Bryce Elder is. BJH Blitz said, isn't tonight a good night to just crapshoot pitchers and load up for home runs? Yeah. That's kind of what I was getting back to when I was talking about how I expect my pitcher exposures to change without Sale. I ideally, for the most part, am probably just playing similar amounts of a lot of these guys. If any of these guys really get inflated ownership, I probably want to go a different direction because they're all just so similar from a range of outcome standpoint. This is a really, really good example of the difference between using a Sims tool versus just a regular optimizer as well, and why you kind of have to be more careful with how you're using optimizers. This is something, again, that if you are subscribed to Endgame, or if you're going to subscribe, Uticow uses optimizers more than Sims, and he went through his process, how he does some things that I don't necessarily need to do because I use Sims. Obviously, what he does works extremely well for him, but this is something where you also need to just understand and be familiar with what products you are using and sort of what the limitations on those products are. Because when you look at the projections here, if you're just using an optimizer, John Gray, Gilbert Diaz, Gavin Williams, they're going to show up as, if you just let the optimizer run, they're going to show up way more frequently than Montero and Daniel and Feltner. Whereas if you're using a sim, or you're using an optimizer in a way that does account for range of outcomes through randomness, you're going to see that it really flattens out a lot. These 2 points in projection really don't mean a ton, and their chances of having a good game relative to each other are pretty similar. So back to to get back to that question, ideally, I do think I end up with pretty similar exposures to a lot of these pitchers, because I don't really think the difference between the best and the worst is that big. And also, I do think Abbott is the best, but I do also like getting to Colorado against him. And I do think I wouldn't be surprised if I get to even more Colorado now than I did before Sale was scratched, because I do expect that Abbott ownership to increase. Einsteinium said, do you think people prioritize him over Davis Daniel now at the same price point? I'm assuming that him is Bryce Elder. I think they'll be pretty similar. I think that they should be at least. Daniel was getting like 12% ownership before. Like they're very similar. Daniel has a tough matchup against Texas. Elder, tough strikeout matchup there. Elder has a pretty tough strikeout matchup against Arizona. Elder's not a good strikeout pitcher. Daniel doesn't project to be that good of a strikeout pitcher. He does project as a better strikeout pitcher than Elder does. So I think they should be very, very similar at that price point. I'm not sure what people will do. You probably, I would guess, just get a little bit more Daniel because people have known he's pitching all day as opposed to finding out at 5 p.m. Looking back at some of my other stacks, Texas showing up, Atlanta showing up, those are both not surprising at all. Two of the higher implied run totals on the slate. Atlanta going up against Diaz making his major league debut. He projects as a pretty good pitcher, but it is his major league debut. It is a relatively tough spot against the talented Atlanta lineup. So obviously, there's a lot of volatility there. There's really high ceiling for the Braves. Texas in a pretty good spot, in a good stadium against Daniel. He has good numbers so far. They are inflated by probably the best start he'll ever make in the major leagues against Detroit a week or two ago. So he projects as sort of just a guy, and the Rangers look good, pretty good as a result. So, in these top 5 stacks, Colorado, the one that is like the most interesting to talk about because they are going up against Abbott. Then you get, to a couple more of the contrarian stacks. The Angels, not a good spot going up against John Gray, but they are going up against a popular pitcher. They're not a very good offense, but if they do well, you're knocking off 25% on Gray, and you do have value here also. So I would expect that if I look at 5-man Angel stacks, I probably have really good secondary stacks, really good pitching. Well, there isn't really good pitching, but they probably had Chris Sale and good one-offs around them. And again, individually, I'm not just like jamming in these hitters. I'm getting to them quite a bit more than the field. But I'm not putting myself in a position where if one of the lowest probability teams on the slate doesn't have a good game, I'm just losing all my money. I think that's another thing that kind of gets sort of lost in talking about tournaments. There's, in top heavy tournaments, obviously you want to be playing to win, but you don't want to be completely just saying, oh, well, I'm just going to like not, I don't care if I cash. I'm going to just play these lineups that are never going to cash except for once in a while, everything goes right and I win. Like you're going to lose a lot of money that way, as opposed to, diversifying in a way that makes sense, not putting all of your eggs in the lowest owned team every night and just waiting for them to win. So again, kind of like with Colorado, you can see here that I'm 2 to 3x the projected ownership on most Angels guys. But, if they suck, it's not a huge deal. I don't have tons and tons of any of them. If I look at those lineups, the 5-mans, I only had 2 full 5-man stacks of the Angels. So it does look like I was using them as mini stacks more also. But like I said, Sale, Abbott, Corey Seager is a one-off, so a really good one-off there. Had the Texas mini stack. This next lineup, Sale, Abbott, Candelario, Riley, Duvall. So paying up for Riley and Sale, makes a lot of sense. So that's what I would expect. If you're going to a team like the Angels, you're getting that negative correlation. D Pope said, any thoughts on FanDuel? I haven't run anything for FanDuel. I'm playing it, but just not going to have time before the show to do that for both of those. And because I do want this to be a more specific look at how I would be attacking the slate instead of like how I might be. Not going to touch on that much. The same strategies apply. The difference obviously is that you don't have the same sort of ownership going to bad pitchers on FanDuel because you only have to roster one. But today it does apply because you don't have good pitchers there either. So like again, I don't have numbers in front of me, but like if Abbott is projected for 50% ownership and then the other 50% ownership is just spread out to these other pitchers, the same thing I'm talking about on DraftKings applies there, where Colorado just like gets really pushed up the board because they have such a strong negative correlation to the field if Abbott doesn't pitch well. But I don't want to get too much into FanDuel just because it's a lot of me speculating what I'd be doing versus being able to just look at it like I am with DraftKings. But the same strategies apply as far as everything I'm talking about from an overarching standpoint. The names and teams might change, but same strategies. BJH said Texas mini fits nicely with Atlanta minis if you're willing to use Montero. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, especially if Montero's ownership continues to be projected pretty low. I forgot I had highlighted the Angels. I was really confused. So Angels and then the White Sox also are showing up for me a bit. Probably, mostly as mini stacks. So again, with the White Sox, I'm not getting a lot of 5-man White Sox stacks. They suck. I don't really want that much of them, but they can still be a useful team to offset some ownership, get to a somewhat popular pitcher in Paddock against them. So you can see here, like 3 White Sox with 4 Reds and Sale Abbott. So popular stack, popular pitchers, low owned Sosa, Benintendi, and Pham against a relatively popular pitcher. So that lineup is contrarian, even though it's got the Reds and it's got what were the 2 most popular pitchers. Same thing here. White Sox with the Reds. White Sox with, I don't know, a bunch of random stuff. That's just a random stack that I don't play too many of those. Here you get a 5-man White Sox, and this is important too. Like where you do get to that low probability stack, the 5-man White Sox stack, rounding it out with the two best pitchers on the slate and a 3-man of the best projected offense on the slate. Like once you have this relatively unlikely to succeed White Sox stack that is low owned, you don't then need to also play like the Rockies with them. Not to say that you can't, but generally you're going to want a higher probability team than, the Rockies or the Tigers, for example, with a team like the White Sox. So I think that's important as well. And then finally, just to take a look at, I guess, some of the individual hitters here, you can see nothing too crazy as far as my highest owned guys. 40% Candelario, 32% Buxton. Usually on like full-size slates, normally my highest owned hitters end up being around 30%. That's a mark that I like being at just because of how often they fail. It's not a mark that I like hard code into anything. And on shorter slates, it does end up changing a bit. Also, when it ends up being, good players, especially if it were like, I'll get Bobby Witt 50% sometimes. And it's just like, yeah, whatever. He's going to steal 2 bases and double anyway. But for the most part, you can see my hitter exposures coming in still below that mark, even on the 5-gamer. Candelario, just, one of the clear best third base plays. Byron Buxton, one of the clear best outfield plays going up against Flexen. De La Cruz, great play at shortstop. So getting to those guys, obviously perfectly fine. Will Benson projected to hit 8th. I'm not sure if that lineup's come out since I've been doing the show, but he was projected to hit 8th. Usually you're not going to see me getting this much of an 8-hole hitter, but it is a 5-game slate. And he was one of the lower owned guys on Cincinnati, still popular, but relatively low owned. Then getting the more Cincinnati guys. Using Diaz a lot, I think, makes sense. You can see using these Rockies guys as well. Just kind of looking at what some lineups look like to have Diaz that I'd be playing. Full Rocky stack there. A lot of full Rocky stacks, which isn't surprising since I'd said they were a team I was getting a lot of. Here, I think I'd already looked at this one, but high probability team overall, going Texas, Cincinnati, but then you're negatively correlating with the field with Diaz. Same thing here, Minnesota, Reds, Texas, Diaz. Again, the fact that he's facing a popular pitcher adds on to, like, compounds with the fact that he himself is low owned. So that's something to keep in mind with players like Diaz. A couple more questions. Paul McCarthy said sales out, right? Yeah, Elder starting, sales out. That was announced like as I hit the go live button on the show. So there was absolutely nothing that was going to be done about that on my end. Is Paddock on a pitch count? My assumption is sort of. He missed like 2 weeks with arm fatigue. He had Tommy John surgery last year, so it's not really unusual. He didn't make a rehab start. The Twins said that they were happy with how his rehab process was going. I would be surprised if you're getting like 100 pitches from Paddock. He wasn't really doing that even before his time on the injured list. I don't think that you're looking at like a 4-inning limit or a 60-pitch limit or anything like that. For all intents and purposes on this slate, I think Chris Paddock is probably fine. Like, I think he probably throws like 80 pitches if he's pitching well. And on this slate, that could easily be a top 2 scorer. So I'm not like downgrading or anything. I think the industry as a whole has him projected pretty much like I would expect, that like 75, 80 pitch range is pretty much where I'd be comfortable with. So I'm not like doing anything to downgrade him, especially on this slate. TTID said, I'm doing 8 lineups tonight. So do you feel with that limited amount of lineups, would you essentially play 100% of your top pitcher? You could. It's not. It really depends on the slate. Like if Chris Sale were still on the slate, I would assume that my top 8 lineups all have Chris Sale or had Chris Sale. Here, I don't think. Like, I don't want to say it's wrong or it's a mistake. If you have Andrew Abbott in what you think are your top 8 lineups, then fine, play them. With the pitching in general on this slate, I wouldn't be surprised at all if you have like a solid process and then look at your top 8 lineups. If it's just like a mix match of pitching everywhere, a lot of it, obviously is just going to depend on each specific slate and how good the pitchers are, what the alternatives are. And so in this case, when Sale was there was no alternative to Sale. I would have been fully expecting to just get 8 out of 8 of him. Now everybody's like the same for the most part. So there are a lot of just ways you can mix and match pitching. And then the other thing is that because, the negative correlation piece, if you're playing 8 lineups, the Rockies are still a really powerful stack for you. You might only want to play 1 or 2 of them because, you don't want your whole night coming down to the Rockies. But if you're playing if Andrew Abbott, for example, is your top pitcher and you're playing him 8 times, then you just completely lost the ability to get to what looks like the most powerful negatively correlated stack. So it's really, really slate dependent. I wouldn't say that like I'm always just going to play my top pitcher 100% of the time. This is a slate where I would think that I probably don't. Yeah. So he followed up and said, yeah. So I think I touched on that one too. Well, one other thing with the hedging component, it's not. I don't go into the slate saying I'm going to hedge against my SP1 or my SP2 or whatever it may be, just for the sake of doing it. There are a lot of slates where I don't really get to stacks against either one. I don't want to just like on a bigger slate. Let's say this slate had 10 games, but it was still just like really, really crappy pitching, except you have Chris Sale and you have Garrett Crochet both pitching. And everybody else is just like dog shit pitching the rest of the slate. I'm pretty likely to just be playing a massive amount of Crochet and Sale and then playing low-owned offenses because there's 10 games and I can find low-owned offenses. So it's not just like saying, oh, well, I'm playing a lot of Sale and Crochet. Let me also make sure I'm playing against both of them, because in that hypothetical, they're such clear-cut good plays that I don't want to just be necessarily going against them for the sake of it. But when you're getting a slate like this, even if this were a little bit bigger slate, but if it were a similar quality of pitching, you're getting a slate like this where the pitchers that are popular just because of things that have nothing to do with them. They're popular because of who they're facing. They're popular because there's no other good pitcher to go to. Against pitchers like that, even though I'm going to end up playing a lot of them because I have to play pitchers, those are the guys that I'm looking to get stacks against. And so it is kind of hedging, but I think people can kind of get in trouble looking at it from that standpoint. Like, I don't think you want to just like artificially go in and say, oh, well, I'm hedging against my pitcher because XYZ. There are spots where it makes sense. There are spots where it makes less sense. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have for this one. Sorry that Chris Sale got scratched as it got started. I think going forward, it'll be a little bit better show because I won't have to guess at what the field's going to do. I'll have, a better answer of how things look and what I'm playing. The other thing that I didn't touch on since I was going through exposures, or, the exposures that I had, Arizona does look quite a bit better now. Corbin Carroll, Peterson, I don't think we have their lineup yet, but assuming it's, Carroll, Peterson, Marte, whatever other lefties they have, they are going to look better now because obviously you're facing Bryce Elder and not Chris Sale. But that's all I have for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, leave comments. If I didn't touch on something or didn't do something that you think would be productive going forward, let me know. But yeah, planning on running this back during the week at that same time slot. I enjoy doing the show, so hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And good luck on your lineups tonight.